I was unpacking the last box in my new apartment when my phone buzzed. A message from my dad with a single photo attachment. "Found this gem while cleaning out the garage," he wrote. "Thought you might want it." It was a picture from my wedding day 3 months ago, taken from the back of the church during the ceremony. I smiled at first, remembering how beautiful that day had felt, how perfect everything seemed. Then I zoomed in to get a better look at myself in my dress, and my blood turned to ice. There, in the background, behind the altar, was something that shouldn't have been there, something that made me immediately dial 911. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm 29 years old, a pediatric nurse from Phoenix, and until 3 months ago, I thought I was living the perfect life. I had just married my college sweetheart Marcus, bought our dream house, and felt like everything was finally falling into place. My family had always been complicated, but on my wedding day, even they seemed to be on their best behavior, or so I thought. Growing up, my dad, Roberto, had always been the family photographer. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone, there he was with his camera, clicking away like he was documenting history. He took pride in capturing what he called the real moments, the candid shots when people thought nobody was looking. Mom used to joke that he had more pictures than memories, but I found it endearing. In a family that didn't talk much about feelings, his photos felt like his way of saying he cared. The relationship with my family had always been strained, though I spent years convincing myself it was normal. My parents, Roberto and Carmen, had this way of making everything about them, even when it wasn't. My younger brother, Diego, was their golden child, the one who could do no wrong, while I was the responsible one, the one who cleaned up messes and asked no questions. When I announced my engagement to Marcus, my mom's first response wasn't, "Congratulations." It was, "Well, I hope you're not expecting us to pay for anything fancy." Planning the wedding became a battlefield. Every decision I made was questioned, criticized, or undermined. The venue was too expensive, even though Marcus and I were paying for it ourselves. My dress was too revealing, even though it was more conservative than anything I'd worn in years. The guest list was too small because I didn't invite my dad's drinking buddies from work. But I pushed through because I wanted that one perfect day, that one moment where my family could just be happy for me without finding something to complain about. The morning of the wedding, I remember feeling this strange mix of joy and anxiety. I was marrying the love of my life, but I also knew I'd be walking on eggshells all day, trying to keep everyone happy and avoid the inevitable family drama. My bridesmaids, my best friend Sophia, and Marcus's sister Rachel kept telling me to relax, that it was my day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. The ceremony itself was beautiful. St. Mary's Cathedral was decorated with white roses and baby's breath, exactly like I'd dreamed. Marcus looked handsome in his navy suit, and when I walked down the aisle, the look in his eyes made me forget about everything else, at least for those precious few minutes. My dad walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and for a moment, I thought maybe this would be the day everything changed between us. After the ceremony, during the reception, I noticed my dad disappearing periodically. He'd be there for a few minutes, camera in hand, then vanish for 20 or 30 minutes at a time. When I asked him about it, he said he was just getting different angles, capturing the whole story. I didn't think much of it then. Dad had always been obsessive about his photography, and I figured he was just being thorough. The reception went smoothly, considering. There were the usual family tensions simmering under the surface. My Uncle Luis got a little too drunk and started telling inappropriate stories during his speech. My mom spent half the night complaining about the music being too loud. Diego brought his girlfriend Melissa, who spent the entire evening taking selfies and posting them on social media with captions about how she couldn't wait for her own wedding. But overall, it felt like we'd managed to have a celebration without any major disasters. Marcus and I left for our honeymoon in Cabo the next morning, exhausted but happy. We spent a week on the beach, drinking margaritas and pretending the real world didn't exist. When we got back, we moved into our new house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from downtown. It wasn't much, but it was ours. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a space that was truly mine, where I didn't have to apologize for existing or worry about walking on eggshells. The first few weeks of married life were everything I had hoped for. Marcus and I fell into an easy routine. I'd work my 12-hour shifts at the children's hospital, and he'd put in long days at the engineering firm. In the evenings, we'd cook dinner together, watch movies, and talk about our plans for the future. We wanted kids, maybe 2 or 3, and we'd already started talking about converting the spare bedroom into a nursery someday. My family predictably had opinions about our new life. Mom called every few days to ask why I hadn't invited them over yet, as if I owed them constant access to my home. Dad would drop by unannounced, always with his camera, always wanting to document our newlywed phase. Diego would text me asking if we needed help with anything, which really meant asking if we had money we could lend him. The same patterns, just in a new setting. I was starting to feel like maybe I'd been too harsh in their judgment of them. Maybe they were trying in their awkward way to be part of my new life. Maybe the wedding had been a turning point and things really could be different now. I was actually feeling optimistic about our relationships when that photo arrived. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. I had just gotten home from a particularly difficult shift. We'd lost a 7-year-old to leukemia, and I was emotionally drained. Marcus was working late, so I decided to tackle some unpacking to keep my mind busy. I was going through a box of miscellaneous items, mostly cards and small decorations from the wedding, when my phone buzzed. The message from Dad seemed innocent enough. He had been going through old boxes in the garage, found some wedding photos he'd forgotten to show us, and thought we might want them. I was actually touched that he'd thought of us. I opened the attachment, expecting to see another generic shot of the church or maybe a candid moment from the reception. Instead, I saw something that made my hands start shaking. The photo was taken from the very back of the church during the ceremony, probably during the vows. You could see the entire altar area, Marcus and I standing together, the priest between us. But in the background, barely visible unless you really looked closely, was a figure that didn't belong there. Someone dressed in dark clothing standing in the shadows behind the altar, partially hidden by the decorative pillars. At first I thought maybe it was a church employee or someone from the wedding party who'd stepped out of place. But as I zoomed in further, I could make out more details that made my stomach drop. The person was holding what looked like a small recording device, pointed directly at the altar. They were also wearing gloves, which seemed odd for a warm September day. Most disturbing of all, I could see part of their face in profile, and I recognized them. It was Vincent Morales, my ex-boyfriend from college, the same Vincent who'd made my life hell for 2 years after I broke up with him. The same Vincent who'd shown up drunk at my apartment multiple times, who'd created fake social media accounts to stalk me online, who'd sent threatening messages to Marcus when he found out we were dating.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The same Vincent I'd had to get a restraining order against 3 years ago. My first instinct was to call Marcus, but then I stopped. What if I was wrong? What if it was just someone who looked like Vincent? What if I was letting my anxiety get the better of me? But the more I stared at the photo, the more certain I became. That was definitely Vincent, and he'd somehow gotten into my wedding, into what should have been the most sacred, protected space of my life. I started thinking about all the little things from the wedding day that hadn't made sense at the time. The side door to the church that I'd noticed was propped open, even though it was usually kept locked. The strange clicking sounds I'd heard during the ceremony that I'd assumed were from Dad's camera. The way the priest had seemed distracted during certain parts of the service, glancing toward the back of the church. It all started to fit together in a way that made me feel sick. What really sent me over the edge was realizing that if Vincent was there, if he'd been recording my wedding, then he'd been planning this for months. He'd somehow found out when and where the ceremony was taking place, figured out how to get inside, and positioned himself to document one of the most private, intimate moments of my life. The thought of him watching me promise my life to Marcus, of him having some kind of recording of that moment, made me feel violated in a way I couldn't even put into words. That's when I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The 911 operator was surprisingly calm when I told her I'd discovered an intruder in photos from my wedding. She asked for my address, took down Vincent's full name, and assured me an officer would be there within 20 minutes. While I waited, I forwarded the photo to my phone and started going through every other picture from the wedding, looking for more evidence of Vincent's presence. What I found made my hands shake even worse. In 7 different photos taken throughout the ceremony, I could spot Vincent in various locations around the church. He wasn't just hiding in one spot behind the altar. He'd been moving around, positioning himself for different angles, like he was conducting some kind of surveillance operation. In one photo, taken during the exchange of rings, I could see him near the side entrance, partially concealed by the confessional booth. In another, captured during the kiss, he was behind a pillar on the opposite side, this time with what looked like a different device in his hands. Officer Patricia Santos arrived exactly 19 minutes after my call. She was a small woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that immediately put me at ease. I showed her the photos on my laptop, zooming in on each instance where Vincent appeared. Her expression grew more serious with each image. "Ma'am, you mentioned a restraining order," Officer Santos said, pulling out her notepad. "Can you tell me more about your history with this individual?" I took a deep breath and started from the beginning. Vincent and I dated during my junior and senior years at Arizona State. At first, he seemed charming, attentive, maybe a little intense, but I mistook that for passion. He was studying film production and always had a camera with him, which I found artistic and interesting. He'd filmed me constantly, saying I was his muse, his inspiration. I thought it was romantic. The problem started gradually. He became possessive, questioning every friendship I had, especially with male classmates. He'd show up at my dorm unexpectedly, claiming he just wanted to surprise me, but it felt more like checking up on me. When I tried to create boundaries, he'd become emotional, crying and apologizing, promising to change. The cycle repeated itself over and over until I realized I was walking on eggshells in my own life. The breaking point came during my senior year when I discovered he'd been secretly recording our intimate moments. I found a hidden camera in his bedroom, disguised as a clock, with hours of footage of us together. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. Instead, he claimed it was for a documentary project about modern relationships, that I should feel honored to be his subject. I broke up with him that night and moved in with Sophia temporarily. That's when Vincent's behavior escalated from controlling to dangerous. He started following me around campus, sitting in the back of my classes, showing up at my work-study job at the library. He'd leave gifts outside my dorm room, flowers and handwritten notes declaring his love and his certainty that we were meant to be together forever. When I started dating other people, he'd somehow find out and confront them, claiming I was still his girlfriend, that they were interfering with his relationship. The worst incident happened 6 months after graduation. I'd moved back to Phoenix and was working at my first nursing job when Vincent appeared at the hospital where I worked. He'd driven down from Flagstaff, where he was supposedly working as a freelance videographer, and waited for me in the parking lot after my shift. When I tried to walk past him to my car, he grabbed my arm and started sobbing, begging me to give him another chance. I told him to let go of me, that I'd call security if he didn't leave immediately. That's when his demeanor completely changed. The tears stopped, his grip tightened, and he looked at me with this cold, calculating expression I'd never seen before. He told me I was making a mistake, that no one would ever love me the way he did, that I belonged to him whether I admitted it or not. He said he had enough footage of our time together to ruin my reputation if I didn't come back to him. Security guards eventually intervened, but Vincent had already made his point. Over the next year, he continued to harass me through fake social media accounts, anonymous emails, and occasional surprise visits to places I frequented. He seemed to know my schedule, my routines, where I lived and worked. I changed apartments twice, but he always found me somehow. The restraining order came after he showed up at my cousin's quinceañera uninvited and unwelcome with a video camera. He claimed he was documenting Latino family traditions for a cultural project, but my family knew better. My Uncle Miguel, who worked in law enforcement, helped me file the paperwork. The order prohibited Vincent from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, or my workplace. For almost 2 years, the restraining order seemed to work. I didn't see Vincent, didn't receive any suspicious messages, and started to believe he had finally moved on with his life. I met Marcus through a mutual friend, and for the first time since college, I felt safe enough to be in a relationship. Marcus knew about Vincent, knew about the restraining order, and was incredibly supportive and understanding about my need for security and privacy. When Marcus and I got engaged, we were careful about announcing it publicly. We kept our engagement photos off social media, only told close family and friends about the wedding details, and even asked the church to keep our ceremony information confidential. I thought we'd taken every precaution to keep Vincent from finding out about our plans. Officer Santos listened to my entire story without interrupting, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions about dates and specific incidents. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, studying the photos again. "Mrs. Torres, this is clearly a violation of the restraining order, but it's also potentially much more serious than that. The fact that he gained unauthorized access to a private venue, that he was recording without consent, and that he managed to evade detection for an extended period suggests a level of planning and sophistication that's concerning." She explained that they'd need to investigate how Vincent had gained access to the church, whether he'd had help from anyone on the inside, and what he'd done with any recordings he might have made. She also wanted to examine my family's role in the situation, since they would have been responsible for coordinating with the church and managing guest lists. That's when a horrible thought occurred to me. I asked Officer Santos to wait while I called the church directly. Father Martinez, who had performed our ceremony, was still in his office despite the late hour. When I explained the situation and asked about security protocols for the wedding day, his response made my stomach drop. "I do remember something unusual," Father Martinez said slowly. "About an hour before the ceremony, a young man approached me, claiming to be your cousin. He said the family had hired him to take some additional photos from different angles, that he had permission to position himself in areas where guests typically aren't allowed."
He seemed to know details about your family, mentioned your father Roberto specifically. I assumed he was legitimate. My blood ran cold. Vincent had somehow researched my family enough to convincingly impersonate a relative. He'd manipulated a priest, gained access to restricted areas of the church, and positioned himself to document my wedding day like it was his personal project. But the most disturbing part was that he'd mentioned my dad by name. After Officer Santos left, promising to follow up within 24 hours, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the wedding photos spread across my coffee table. Each image that contained Vincent felt contaminated now, like a beautiful memory that had been infected with something poisonous. But more than that, I was starting to question everything about my wedding day, everything about my family's behavior, and everything about how Vincent had managed to orchestrate such an elaborate invasion of my privacy. I started thinking about my dad's frequent disappearances during the reception, his obsessive photography, his insistence on getting shots from every possible angle. I thought about how he'd known exactly where to position himself to capture that wide shot of the altar, the same shot that had inadvertently exposed Vincent's presence. I thought about how he'd waited 3 months to share this particular photo, long enough for me to settle into married life and feel safe again. The more I considered it, the more questions arose. How had Vincent known the exact date and location of our wedding when we'd been so careful about privacy? How had he known enough about my family to convincingly impersonate a cousin? And most importantly, why had my dad waited until now to send me a photo that clearly showed someone who shouldn't have been there? I picked up my phone to call Marcus, then hesitated. He was working late on a project deadline, and I knew this news would devastate him. Our wedding day was supposed to be the beginning of our life together, not evidence of how far my past was willing to go to intrude on our future. But I also knew I couldn't handle this alone, couldn't carry the weight of what I was beginning to suspect about my own family's involvement. When Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice tired but warm, I started crying before I could say a word. All I managed to get out was "come home" before the tears took over completely. He didn't ask questions, just said he'd be there in 20 minutes. While I waited for my husband, I stared at the photo one more time, focusing not on Vincent, but on the technical aspects of the shot. The angle, the lighting, the composition. It was perfectly framed to capture both the ceremony and the evidence of the intruder. Almost like whoever took it wanted me to see exactly what I'd seen. That's when I realized this wasn't just about Vincent stalking me. This was about someone in my own family setting me up to discover the truth. And I was terrified to find out why. Marcus arrived home 23 minutes later to find me sitting on our kitchen floor, surrounded by printed wedding photos and my laptop open to email conversations with my family for months before the wedding. I'd been digging through everything, looking for clues about how Vincent could have known so many intimate details about our plans. My husband took one look at the scene and immediately sat down beside me on the tile floor, not even asking what had happened. He just pulled me close and waited until I was ready to speak. When I finally showed him the photo and explained about Vincent being at our wedding, Marcus went completely silent. I watched his face cycle through confusion, anger, and finally a cold determination I'd never seen before. "We're calling Detective Rodriguez tomorrow," Marcus said quietly. "This isn't just stalking anymore. This is organized harassment, and someone helped him do it." Detective Rodriguez was Officer Santos's supervisor, a veteran investigator who specialized in stalking and harassment cases. When we met with him the next morning, he listened to our story with the same serious attention, but his questions were more pointed, more strategic. "Mrs. Torres, I need you to think carefully about your family's reaction when you announced your engagement. Did anyone seem unusually interested in the details? Did anyone ask questions that seemed odd at the time?" I thought back to the family dinner where Marcus and I had shared our news. My parents had been seated at opposite ends of their dining room table, my mom picking at her enchiladas while my dad dominated the conversation as usual. Diego had been there with Melissa, both of them more interested in their phones than our announcement. But now, replaying that evening with fresh perspective, I remembered how my dad had immediately started asking about logistics. Where would we have the ceremony? What church were we considering? How many guests were we planning to invite? At the time, I had assumed he was just being practical, maybe worried about costs, even though we had made it clear we were paying for everything ourselves. My mom asked different questions. She wanted to know about the timeline, when we'd be sending invitations, whether we'd chosen a photographer yet. She even offered to help with addressing envelopes and managing RSVPs, which had seemed uncharacteristically helpful at the time. Diego was the most subtle. He asked about security, whether we were worried about uninvited guests showing up, whether the church had protocols for handling disruptions. I thought he was just being protective, looking out for his big sister, but now I wondered if there was another reason for his concern. Detective Rodriguez made notes about each family member's questions and reactions. Then he asked something that made my stomach clench. "Has anyone in your family ever expressed sympathy for Vincent? Ever suggested that maybe you were too harsh with the restraining order, or that he deserved another chance?" The memory hit me like a physical blow. About 6 months after I'd gotten the restraining order, my mom had been visiting my apartment when she casually mentioned that she'd run into Vincent at the grocery store. She said he looked thin and sad, that he'd asked about me with genuine concern in his voice. She'd told me that people could change, that holding grudges wasn't healthy, that maybe I should consider giving him a chance to apologize properly. I had been furious with her for even talking to Vincent, for not immediately walking away when she recognized him. But my mom had defended her decision, saying she was just being polite, that he seemed like he was trying to get his life together. The conversation had ended in an argument, with me explaining once again why Vincent was dangerous, and my mom insisting I was being dramatic. Now I wondered if that grocery store encounter had been as accidental as my mom claimed. I wondered if she'd been in contact with Vincent more than once, if she'd been feeding him information about my life without realizing the consequences. Detective Rodriguez asked for my parents' contact information and permission to interview them. I hesitated, knowing this would explode whatever fragile relationship we had left, but Marcus squeezed my hand and reminded me that my safety was more important than keeping the peace. The detective also wanted to examine all of my dad's photos from the wedding day, not just the ones he'd shared with me. He explained that there might be additional evidence we hadn't discovered yet, maybe even images that showed how Vincent had gained access to the church or whether he had any accomplices. When I called my dad that afternoon to request copies of all his wedding photos, his response was strange. Instead of immediately agreeing, he hesitated, asking why I needed them, whether something was wrong. When I explained about Vincent being in the background of one image, my dad's silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Dad? Are you there?" "I'm here, mija," he said finally, but his voice sounded different, tired, guilty. "I'll get you those photos. All of them." That evening, instead of emailing the photos as I had expected, my dad showed up at our house with a thick manila envelope and an expression I'd never seen before. He looked older somehow, like he'd aged years in the span of a single day. Marcus offered him coffee, but my dad declined, saying he couldn't stay long. He handed me the envelope and sat heavily on our couch, his hands clasped tightly in his lap.
"Elena, there's something I need to tell you," he began, and I felt my world start to shift before he'd even finished the sentence. Over the next hour, my dad told me a story that shattered every assumption I'd made about my family's involvement in Vincent's stalking. 6 months before my wedding, Vincent had contacted my dad directly, claiming to be a freelance journalist working on a story about military families and their children's career choices. He'd said he was particularly interested in stories about children who'd chosen healthcare careers, like nursing, and wondered if he could interview our family. My dad, always eager for attention and validation, had been flattered by the interest. He'd agreed to meet Vincent for coffee, bringing along photo albums and sharing stories about my childhood, my education, my career achievements. Vincent had been charming and professional, asking thoughtful questions and taking careful notes. But as their conversations continued over several weeks, Vincent's questions had become more personal. He'd wanted to know about my relationships, my fears, my daily routines. He'd asked about upcoming family events, whether I was seeing anyone seriously, whether I seemed happy with my life in Phoenix. My dad, who had always struggled with boundaries and loved being the center of attention, had shared far more than he should have. He'd told Vincent about my engagement before we'd even announced it publicly. He'd shared details about our wedding planning, including the church we'd chosen and the approximate date we were considering. "I thought he was just being thorough," my dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He made it sound like the article would be really positive, like it would highlight our family's success story. I was proud of you, Elena. I wanted people to know how well you'd done." But the worst revelation was still coming. Vincent had eventually admitted to my dad that he was my ex-boyfriend, that he was hoping to reconnect with me and make amends for past mistakes. He'd convinced my dad that I was being stubborn and unreasonable, that the restraining order was an overreaction to a simple misunderstanding between young people who'd been in love. Vincent had painted himself as a reformed man who'd learned from his mistakes and just wanted the chance to apologize properly. He'd shown my dad articles he'd supposedly written for legitimate publications, fabricated references from editors and colleagues, even fake credentials from journalism organizations. My dad had believed every word. More than that, he'd become an active participant in Vincent's deception. He'd provided Vincent with our wedding invitation as proof of the date and location. He'd shared photos of me from recent family gatherings so Vincent could see how happy I looked. He'd even given Vincent a basic layout of St. Mary's Cathedral based on his own memories of attending services there. "He convinced me that surprising you at the wedding would be romantic," my dad said, tears streaming down his face. "He said he just wanted to see you happy on your special day, that he wouldn't approach you or cause any disruption. He made it sound like he was trying to find closure, not stalking me," I finished, my voice flat with shock and fury. My dad nodded miserably. "I didn't know about the restraining order until after the wedding. Vincent never mentioned it, and you'd never told us the details about why you broke up with him. I thought he was just a boyfriend who'd made some mistakes, not someone who'd been harassing you for years. Marcus had been silent throughout my dad's confession, but now he stood up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. You gave him access to our wedding, he said, his voice deadly quiet. You helped a stalker infiltrate the most important day of our lives because you wanted to be part of some fake newspaper story? I didn't know, my dad repeated, but the words sounded hollow even to him. You didn't ask, I said, finding my voice again. You didn't think to check with me before sharing my personal information with a stranger? You didn't consider that maybe there was a reason I'd never mentioned this person to you? The room fell silent, except for the sound of my dad crying. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, placing it on our coffee table. He's more, he said. Vincent gave me this after the wedding. He said it was a backup copy of his interview notes, that I should keep it in case the article was ever challenged. I didn't listen to it until yesterday, after you called asking for the photos. I stared at the recorder, afraid to touch it, afraid to know what other violations Vincent had managed to capture with my own father's help. What's on it? Marcus asked. My dad's face crumpled completely. Your wedding vows, he whispered. He recorded your entire ceremony. The recording contained 47 minutes of audio from our wedding ceremony. Vincent had captured everything from the processional music to our final kiss as husband and wife. But the worst disturbing than the recording itself was hearing my dad's voice in the background, quietly narrating details about the guests, the decorations, and my emotional reactions throughout the ceremony. Detective Rodriguez arrested Vincent 3 days later at his apartment in Flagstaff. They found an entire room dedicated to surveillance equipment and photos of me spanning the past 5 years. Hidden cameras, telephoto lenses, and hundreds of images taken from outside my workplace, my apartment, restaurants where Marcus and I had eaten dinner. The wedding recording was just the latest addition to his obsessive documentation of my life. Vincent had been using my dad as an unwitting informant for months, extracting information through their fake friendship and using it to track my movements and anticipate my plans. The journalist's story had been completely fabricated, designed specifically to exploit my dad's vanity and desire for recognition. During the investigation, we learned that Vincent had attempted to contact my mom and Diego as well, but they'd been less receptive to his manipulation. My mom had hung up on him after his first call, sensing something wasn't right about his questions. Diego had simply ignored his messages entirely. The criminal charges against Vincent included stalking, violation of a restraining order, unlawful surveillance, trespassing, and identity fraud. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and 5 years of supervised probation afterwards. The judge also issued a permanent restraining order that extended to any contact with my family members. My relationship with my dad never recovered. The betrayal cut too deep, and his willingness to share my private information with a stranger revealed a fundamental lack of respect for my boundaries and safety. Marcus and I moved to Denver 6 months later, where I accepted a position at Children's Hospital Colorado. We didn't tell our family our new address. 2 years later, I gave birth to our daughter, Sophia, in a hospital where my dad will never find us, surrounded by people who understand that love means protecting someone's peace, not exploiting their trust for personal validation. Sometimes family isn't about blood connections. Sometimes it's about choosing people who would never hand over your wedding photos to someone who wants to hurt you. Vincent was released last month. I know this because the victim services coordinator called to inform me. But this time, I'm not afraid. I'm prepared, I'm protected, and most importantly, I'm surrounded by people who would never mistake enabling a stalker for being helpful. That makes all the difference in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.